This is Western Civilization 1. I'm Dr. Young, your instructor. And when we left off the last lecture, we had talked about this very important term, the polis, in ancient Greece. Polis translated as city-state, the basic political, economic, and cultural unit of ancient Greece, the primary form of identity that ancient Greek people had. They identified primarily with the place they were from, their birthplace, as it were. And even if they had this overarching sense of being connected to other Greeks, their primary loyalty was to their home polis. And this is the state that Greece was in as it moved into what we call the Classical Age. Now, the dating of the Classical Age, let's use a nice round number and say about 500 BCE. Really, if we want to be a little more accurate, it kind of stretches from the end of the Persian War in the 470s up till the 330s, 338, when Philip of Macedon really established himself as the de facto ruler over the Greek world. So we're talking only about a 150-year period here. But it may be the most famous and most influential period in all of Western civilization. So we're going to devote this lecture to it. And this was the period when Greece was dominated by the polis, these individually governed, individually managed city-states. And as we said last time, most of these were small. The vast majority of them were small and self-contained. The two major exceptions to that rule of small size were Athens and Sparta. There were other polis that were of substantial size as well: Thebes, Corinth, Megara, and several others were quite large. But the two most famous and two most significant polis were Athens and Sparta. Athens' population in the 5th century was probably somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 people. And it occupied a landmass that encompassed the entire peninsula of Attica. Now, I probably should go back to a map here. Let me move back. So let's go back to this map for a moment here. Attica is this entire peninsula right here. So the Saronic Gulf is right here. You got the Isthmus of Corinth, and pretty much everything from the Isthmus of Corinth down this peninsula belonged to Athens. This is a landmass roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island, which is not very big by our standards, but for ancient Greece this is a huge amount of territory. And so perhaps 500,000 people lived there. The vast majority of which actually lived in the city of Athens. And so its population dwarfed that of any other polis. Now, Sparta, on the other hand, did not have the same size of population. Sparta's down here. And really, Sparta was just a collection of small villages that ultimately came together to form a polis. But by the 6th century, Sparta controlled most of the southern third of the Peloponnesus, like at least these two peninsulas right here, and was even bigger than Athens. In fact, like twice the size, maybe 3 times the size of the Athenian polis, and so also quite large, particularly in Greek terms. Now, these are exceptions, but it's also the fact that the vast majority of evidence, historical evidence that from ancient Greece, comes from one of these two cities. Athens far more than Sparta, but plenty of really convincing, interesting evidence from Sparta as well. And so I want to take most of this lecture to talk about these two polis. And one of the points of doing this is to show how different polis could be. And we might hold up Sparta and Athens as extreme examples of difference, and they were unique, very much so. But this is also indicative of the local variation that existed in the classical Greek world. Okay, so let's talk about Sparta first, and that's not for the sake of preference, it's just how I've got this thing organized. Both Athens and Sparta are really interesting, so hopefully you'll find this compelling. Okay. Sparta's quite famous. I often have students who, when I mention Sparta, they get a smile on their face, or they might even say something like, yeah, and they may be thinking of the movie 300 or whatever, which I hate to break it to you is terribly historically inaccurate in almost every respect. And it's not the first attempt to make a story out of the legendary 300 Spartans of the Battle of Thermopylae. But in any case, Sparta, there's some really interesting things about Sparta. The main thing is this was a warrior polis, dominated by warriors, incredibly bellicose, in fact, a fully militarized society, arguably the most militarized society that has ever existed in world history. And I can think of only a very few competitors to that. Maybe the ancient Assyrians, though they existed on a vastly larger scale. Possibly some of the modern militarized nations like North Korea, where the amount of expenditure on military stuff just dwarfs out of anything else. But the militarism of Sparta was built into their whole cultural and social system. It determined the way that they organized themselves entirely. How did Sparta become so militaristic is the question we need to ask. Well, this goes back very early in the Archaic Age to the 8th century, and then with recurrences in the 7th century, when Sparta fought a series of wars against its neighbors to the west. And so, if you can envision again, without me having to go back to the map, if you can envision the Peloponnesus, that peninsula at the bottom of Greece, Sparta is in the middle, kind of the middle river valley there, right in the middle of the southern part of the Peloponnesus. To the west, across some mountains, was a land known as Messenia. And Sparta fought a series of wars against the Messenians, defeated them, and decided to attempt to enslave the entire population of Messenians. Now, by enslave, we don't mean chattel slavery where they bought and sold them in slave markets, although they probably did buy and sell some of the Messenians, depending on the circumstances. But the Messenians lived in their homes, lived in their own homes, but all of the farming they did at the behest of the Spartans, and in fact they were the ones responsible for all of the manual labor in the society. The Messenians were incorporated into Sparta, and they were slaves. Now the word for this is Helots. And so the Helots, the Messenian Helots, became the backbone of the Spartan economy. And the elite Spartans, of course, were very impressed by this, by what they had done. This was a good thing for them. They didn't have to really work anymore. But the Messenians, of course, were not very happy with this and were in a near constant state of rebellion for the first few years of this situation, so that Sparta had to fight numerous times against them. Now, it reached a point, probably in the early 7th century BCE, when Sparta had to make a choice. They either had to let the Helots go and become independent again and do their own thing, or they had to come up with a system that would ensure that the Helots remained in their enslaved position, something that would force them to remain that way. And Sparta chose the latter option. To do this, they took every elite member of society, at least every elite male member of society, set them up in a system which was really quite egalitarian. Every Spartan elite, and this group was known as the homoioi, and you may note the Greek root homo in that word. Homo means the same, of course. And that really was the case. All of these people, all of these homoioi, were the same in terms of the amount of property they held. All of the property, all of the land was turned over to the state, and the state apportioned out to each of the homoioi. And by the way, the way that that's normally translated into English is the similars. We could even say the same ones. And And so each of the Spartan similars received a roughly equal portion of land to that of every other Spartan similar, so that there was no rivalry necessarily, at least over land and wealth, between any of the similars. They had a good amount of land, each of them. They had lots of helots to work that land. They were the masters of the society. And then all of these similars were required to be soldiers. Not part-time soldiers, not occasional soldiers, but rather soldiers for all of their adult lives. From age 7, when they began their training, to age 60, when they were retired from the military. If they lived that long, they were doing military things. So for over 50 years of the standard Spartan life, they were firmly attached to the army, and they were constantly training, fighting. They never really left their militarized situation, not even to spend a lot of time with their families or to procure wives or anything like that. So I'm going to talk about all of these things. All right. Now, education for a Spartan boy began at age 7, when he was taken away from his mother, who had raised him up to that point, turned over to the Spartan police, and sent into the military barracks to begin training. The training was extremely difficult. Physically, mentally, I mean, in terms of abuse and things like that, these Spartan boys suffered a great deal. We get a sense of this from some sources. I'll come back to these points later, but let's look at a primary source here, if I can get it to move that way. Okay. This is a source written hundreds of years actually after the fact, but it was based on earlier accounts. It's the account written by Plutarch, a Greek living during the Roman period. But he talks here about the reforms that the legendary founder of this whole Spartan militaristic system made. His name was Lycurgus. And so when you see the word his or he, that's a reference to Lycurgus. Okay. And we don't know if Lycurgus was a real person, whether this is a kind of legend, you know, what it was. We don't have any direct evidence for the existence of the Lycurgus. But in any case, this is how the Spartan system worked. So as Plutarch recounts here, and let me just read this, instead of softening their feet with shoe or sandal, his rule was to make them hardy through going barefoot. This habit of practice would, as he believed, enable them to scale heights more easily and clamber down precipices with less danger. In fact, with his feet so trained, the young Spartan would leap and spring and run faster unshod than another in the ordinary way. So this was to harden them up, right? They were not allowed to wear shoes. Moreover, as Plutarch continues, they had one single garment that they had to wear, whether it was winter or summer, which meant it was probably too hot in the summer and too cool in the winter. As he says here, thinking that so they would be better prepared to withstand the variations of heat and cold. Again, as regards food, according to his regulation, the iron, or head of the flock, that's kind of the teacher of the young trainees, must see that his messmates gather to the club meal with such moderate food as to avoid bloating, and yet not remain unacquainted with the pains of starvation. In other words, they gave these boys, at times at least, very little to eat, because they wanted to equate them with the process of working and running and fighting and things like this while they were hungry. They would be better able, he says, when occasion demanded, to continue toiling on an empty stomach. But then, Plutarch says, he gave them permission to steal if they were really hungry, right? Which probably most of them were most of the time. Now the question is, who are they going to steal from? Well, they probably stole from the Helots. They may have been encouraged even to steal from other Spartan citizens. I don't know. They probably stole from each other. Now, the boy who, and you know, the way that the education system ran, it punished both bad behavior. If the boys got caught stealing, they would probably be punished because they're trying to develop the qualities of stealth and craftiness and strategy and things like that in these boys. But on the other hand, the boy who had his food stolen probably would be punished, or at the very least ignored, by the powers that be, because he didn't take better care of his equipment or of his food, right? So this is a brutal system. And this continued from about age 7 to about age 18 or so. And there were, of course, many boys who didn't make it through the education, who dropped out, who simply couldn't hack it. These boys were not allowed to leave Sparta. By law, they were to remain in the city, and they were called tremblers. Tremblers were objects of public derision. So they fulfilled this very useful role in public. Soldiers would go out, even the teachers of these young boys would go out, find tremblers, and humiliate them publicly to incentivize the boys they were teaching not to drop out. Tremblers were not allowed to marry, because the Spartans believed very strongly in selective breeding. They thought that if a trembler was married and produced children, that those children would inherit the weak traits that their father had displayed. Nor, by the way, were their sisters allowed to marry. So a trembler did not only cast aspersion on himself, but also his family. And so there were a lot of incentives, of course, put into place to keep people from dropping out and becoming tremblers. Tremblers were also humiliated in other ways physically. You know, there are accounts of the soldiers, you know, shaving like half of the head of a trembler, or maybe shaving off one of his eyebrows or half of his beard or something like that, so that he looked ridiculous. And again, all of this to incentivize people to stay in the army, because the consequences for dropping out were so severe. At around age 20, and by the way, there were a couple-year period where the boys, having finished their normal education, were often co-opted into a kind of secret police force, which would go out and spy on the Messenians in their homes, and develop even more tactics and strategies and skills that were necessary for the army. At age 20, Spartan boys were incorporated into the main army, and they remained there on a provisional basis for 10 years, at which point they were fully inducted in the army, and they served until age 60. And so this is a very long career, and the Spartans were constantly training. The Spartan soldiers very rarely left the company of other soldiers. They lived in the barracks, they lived apart from their families, even when they were married. The purpose in marriage was simply to procreate, so the soldiers would, and I'll talk about the marriage customs in a little bit in further detail, but they only left long enough to impregnate their wives, and they were back in the barracks, right? A couple hours is all that's necessary, or whatever. And so, this was a life of constant training. And you might ask, what's the place of women in all of this? Interestingly, there was a place for women in Spartan society. Unlike in the Assyrian civilization, which we looked at earlier, where women were denigrated to a very, very low status, in Sparta, women actually did have some privileges. Women were educated, mostly by their mothers, but there were formal things required of them. One of the things that we know about Spartan women, for instance, is that they were required to participate in physical education. You can see the statue here on the slide on the right. This is quite a famous bronze statue from Sparta, which shows a woman either running or dancing, wearing a simple garment. You can see that one of the breasts is exposed. This was the kind of the standard female uniform for a Spartan girl. She learned household management and probably cooking and sewing and things like that from her mother, but she also was supposed to be physically fit. Spartan women married rather late. The Spartans believed that women could not, bear children well until they had reached an age of maturity physically. They were right about that, by the way. So unlike in Athens and other polis where women were probably married in their mid or even early teens, Spartan women were probably at least 20 before they were married. Because the men were constantly involved in military training, women actually had a good deal of latitude to pursue their own projects. There are instances, evidence at least, of them participating in trade and other businesses and things like that. Even doing things quite independently of their husbands, and they had to because they never really saw their husbands. They didn't have much of a relationship with them. Women also, it seems, took great pride in their soldier husbands and their soldier sons. There are lots of accounts of Spartan women telling their sons, handing them their hoplon shield and saying, you either come back with this or on it. I will not tolerate a coward in my family, so you'll fight, even if it means your death, right? That may be somewhat cliche, but we do get the sense that women were quite forceful in helping to pass on the military ethos. Women do seem to have exercised some agency. When I teach an upper division class on Greek history, I have the students read a monograph on Spartan women, which is quite fascinating. So we don't need to get into the details of that, but there was a place for women in the society. The government of Sparta formally was a monarchy. In fact, there were two kings, because they acted as a check on each other, and hypothetically speaking, one king was supposed to be leading the military in the field while the other remained at home seeing to domestic affairs. But in truth, the monarchs probably had mostly a ritual function and functioned as war leaders. The Spartans resisted any change, any kind of reform. They never really went through a period of tyranny, unlike most of the other polis. They certainly didn't move in the direction of a democracy like Athens did. They remained very conservative and very set in their ways. The main power in Sparta was placed in the hands of a council of elders called the Gerousia, which was made up of elite soldiers who had reached the age of 60 and been allowed to retire. And here you see again how important warriors and success in war was to Sparta, such that they were willing to turn over all of the main decision-making power in their government to this body of elite warriors who had retired from the military. The economy of Sparta, well, that's a misnomer in some ways, because the Spartans tried to make it so that they were entirely self-sufficient. They, of course, did have an economy, but it was in the hands, the production was mostly in the hands of the Helots, and the elites, the similars, reaped most of the privileges and the benefits of having the Helots produce everything. There were a lot of disincentives to make sure that the Spartans did not become interested in trade. For instance, the Spartans had, and we saw this earlier with the Assyrians, the Spartans had a currency made up of heavy iron bars, which of course had value only in Sparta, and were difficult to transport and had no real intrinsic value. They were not made of precious metals. And so, you can only use them in Sparta, so Spartans really had no opportunity to procure gold or other things that they could use as a medium of exchange to enter into trade with Athenians or with other people, right? They were supposed to stay at home, supposed to devote all of their energies, all of their attention to their military duties. Now, this becomes really bizarre, at least for a modern audience, when we start to talk about marriage relationships. Marriages were all arranged. There was no marriage for love, or even marriages that arose out of prior relationships. Spartan boys and girls became accustomed to seeing each other naked very early on. They were encouraged, in fact, they were taken out to train physically in full view of each other, and Greeks, for the most part, exercised in the nude, and so, that really wasn't, that was something they were simply accustomed to. So, there was no sense of lot of shame when it came to that. Sex was not something necessarily governed by laws of ethics apart from prescriptions against adultery and things like that. Spartan boys and men, because they spent so much time in the barracks with their fellow soldiers, probably many of them, maybe most of them, entered into homosexual relationships. That was simply part of who they were, what they did. That was not castigated with any kind of shame in Sparta or in any other Greek context that we can detect necessarily. And so the marriages were arranged. And there was no real formal ceremony necessarily to mark the wedding. The bride was simply taken to a place where she had been told her husband would meet her in the night. The people preparing the marriage, so to speak, shaved her head and dressed her in men's clothing, and left her there for her new bridegroom to find. He would then go to the place where he had been told she would be waiting for him. He probably had to sneak out of the barracks undetected in order to do this, because, and this is all part of the kind of formal nature of this, though his overseers probably did look the other way, knowing that he was going to meet up with his wife. And he would meet her in the dark, and they would have sex, and that was their primary responsibility, is to have sex and produce children. And then he was supposed to get back to the barracks as quick as he possibly could, and preferably undetected. And so, there's a lot of questions that we could ask about this. So there's a lot of questions that we could ask about this. Sorry, I had to pause the video for a second. About this marriage custom. First of all, why is the woman dressed in men's clothing? Why is her head shaved? There are lots of cultural reasons for that. Hair has been seen by many societies as this very sexually potent thing, and now that she has reached the age where she's married, she no longer needs the hair, so to speak, to attract a spouse or anything like that. The men's clothing is probably because the man was used to being in the company of other men, and so that was to keep him at ease or something. It was certainly, all of this was certainly to signify that this new relationship was not the most important thing in their lives, right? Their duty was to copulate, to have children, to produce the next generation of Spartan warriors, and that was pretty much it. These meetings were always conducted at night, and the new husband and wife would make arrangements to meet up again at some point in the future, and they would get together pretty much until the woman became pregnant, and then she would have a child, and they would start up their sexual relationship again. It was only when the man reached an older age, Spartan men probably married in their early to mid-20s, and when he reached the age of 30, he could leave the army from time to time for a kind of vacation, at which point he would probably spend that with his family, at least somewhat. But it was probably the case that Spartan men and women were married, in some cases for years, without really spending any quality time together, without ever even seeing each other in daylight. And they may have had several children by the time they became, kind of formally acquainted with each other. Now, again, all of this is to send the message that the polis is people's concern. It's not individual relationships, it's the service to the Spartan polis. And again, property was apportioned out in roughly equal fashion to each of the similars, so that there were no rivalries between the individual similars. Okay, so that's Sparta. Now we'll have more to say about Sparta's military activities as we go on here, but let's now turn our attention to Athens, which makes for an interesting subject as well. Athens did go through the changes that we noted in the last lecture, through the different forms of government. Like other polis, it started out as a monarchy. There was a basileus who ruled over Athens early in the Archaic Age. There was also a kind of aristocracy that dominated the politics. There were, in fact, several tribes, they were called in Athens, of elite families who held the lion's share of the power. But by the early 6th century BCE, the Athenian people, because they were fighting in the hoplite phalanx, they were demanding a greater say in what went on in the city affairs. And so there was an aristocrat named Solon who functioned as a kind of a tyrant, although the transition to Solon and his reform seems to have been peaceful. But Solon enacted some reforms that took power, at least a little bit of power, away from the aristocracy and the basileus, and placed it more into the hands of the civilians, the other citizens. They did go through a period of kind of formal tyranny under a guy named Pisistratus in the mid-6th century, and Pisistratus stripped away a lot of power from the aristocrats and placed it in the hands of the common people. And there was a backlash to Pisistratus. He was his children. He tried to set up his children as the rulers of Athens, and they were overthrown. And the aristocrats tried to move it back to the status quo, but this produced a great deal of conflict. Finally, right at the end of the 6th century, there was a guy named Cleisthenes, who, with the support of most of Athens, brought about some really serious reforms that helped to create the democracy that Athens became. Now, I'll come back to these other points in a minute. Let's look at a text briefly. After the tyranny of Pisistratus, people were, they didn't want to go through that again. They didn't want to have a kind of violent cataclysm like they had had with Pisistratus. So they placed power in the hands of Cleisthenes, okay? And this is a text attributed to Aristotle that kind of covers this history. And just note that his first step was to distribute the whole population into 10 tribes in place of the existing 4. In other words, there had been these 4 elite tribes, or elite families, that had dominated Athenian politics. Now he took every person in Athens, every citizen of Athens, and placed them in different tribes so that he could intermix the members of the different tribes and thus move people's identity from their family and tribal identities to identifying rather with the city and becoming invested in the project of the city. He also created these administrative units called demes or demes that became kind of voting precincts, and they were associated with the tribes. Each tribe controlled 3 of these, one, as it says, on the coast, one in the city, and one in the farmland of the interior of Attica. So the author of this says the constitution became much more democratic than under Solon. Athens was moving toward democracy. There were some other things, though, that made Athens fully a democracy. And the main one of these is that Athens built a navy right at the beginning of the 5th century BCE as the Greek world went to war with Persia. Persia had a very strong navy. Athens decided to counter that by building a couple hundred ships, learning to sail them effectively. The Greeks were accustomed to sailing anyway, and Athens was really the first to put their sailing abilities to military purposes. But they built this fleet of a couple hundred ships, and that proved to be a major factor in the full democratization of Athens. Now, the question here is, why would the building of a navy bring about democracy? And, if we were in a classroom, I would let you chew on that one for a second. The answer may not be terribly obvious. But just as with the hoplite phalanx, which we talked about last class, as the basileus and the aristocrats had to recruit people to be part of the hoplite phalanx, to risk their lives in defense or in support of the city, Athens, by building its navy, had to recruit a lot of people. And we're not just talking about landholders here. Okay, the landholders were the infantry of most of the polis, and Athens was the same. A navy requires a lot of people. If each ship of the 200 ships in the Athenian Navy required, say, 200 people to man it, and ships need rowers. In the ancient world, they certainly did. Naval warfare involved largely ramming and boarding, and so you need a lot of people on a ship to take care of those responsibilities. And so 200 or 300 people probably per ship. We're talking about somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 naval soldiers required to man the boats of the Athenian Navy. And these people were putting their lives on the line. It was a risky proposition. It was particularly risky because the Greeks had a cultural belief that if they were not properly buried after death, they could not pass the river Styx and make it into the underworld. And so, these rowers who go out on the sea, if their boat gets sunk, they're not going to be buried properly. They're going to be buried by water, but not by earth. And so they ran the risk of kind of being stuck in limbo in the afterlife. And that was a serious calculation that they had to make. Is it worth it? Well, what do people want in exchange for risking their lives in this manner? And the answer is the same as it was for the hoplite phalanx. They want a say in the way the government works. And in fact, Athens, from about that time on, removed any kind of property qualification for citizenship. All native-born, free-born adult male members of Athenian society were citizens. They did not have to own any property because they were doing something that was very, very important for the polis. Right? So the Navy was a major factor in this. Now I'll talk about the Persian War in more detail later, but that was a key moment here. Another key to Athens' success was its effectiveness in trade. Athens came over the course of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE to practically dominate trade all through the Aegean and even points beyond. How did they do this? Well, first of all, they had a navy, and that helped to ensure that their merchant ships would be protected because their warships were often not far behind. They protected the merchant fleet. But simply having a merchant fleet was not sufficient. They had to have products that were in demand all over the place. And Athens found this in the form of pottery. Okay. Now, you have two images on this slide. The top one is a Greek style of pottery known as black figure pottery, for obvious reasons. And the technique here is to create the image on the pot, and then when it's fired, the faces, the bodies, everything of the people turn this black color. And there's a kind of pleasing aesthetic to this and everything, but it's not very true to life. The Athenians, around 530 or so, came up with a new style of pottery, which you see pictured here at the bottom, called red figure pottery. Now, I don't want to go into the details of how to make these pots. It's a slightly different technique, but the net result of it is that the figures come out looking more natural. Rather than these black figures, you have reddish figures. And this red figure pottery became the must-have item all over the Mediterranean. There's a lot of evidence that, for instance, the Etruscans who lived in the northern part of Italy absolutely loved red figure pottery, that any Etruscan worth his salt would have some red figure pottery somewhere in his house for decoration. And so this was, this was a really hot item. This was like the iPhone of, the 5th century BCE. And by, cranking out these red figure pots and selling them all over the Mediterranean, the Athenians were able to make inroads in trade just about everywhere and deal in lots of different kinds of goods. And so, as a result, Athens was very wealthy, and they put that wealth to use both in putting together a formidable army and navy, and in beautifying their city and pursuing lots of various kinds of projects, cultural, economic, and otherwise. Now, the government of Athens was made up of some key institutions. The most important of these was known as the Eklesia. Translated, that would be something like assembly. Okay, this was the gathering of all Athenian citizens. Now, you might say, okay, how is that practical? If everybody who is, everybody who's a citizen, if Athens has a population of 500,000 people, and everyone who's a citizen can attend the meetings of the Eklesia, that's going to be just incredibly huge and unwieldy. Well, and that's true, but we have to make some qualifications before we delve into this more. First of all, not all people were citizens. Women could not be citizens. Children could not be citizens. Slaves, people who were unfree legally, could not be citizens. And there were a lot of slaves in Athens, just as there were in Sparta. Nor could foreigners. Anyone who was not born in Athens did not meet the qualifications to become citizens. There were a lot of foreigners. The Greek word for this is metic. There were a lot of metics who lived in Athens because of the economic opportunities that existed there. There were even some quite prominent metics in the classical period, but they could not receive citizenship as a result of the rules that the Athenians laid down. So, we're talking here about maybe a fifth, or at most a fourth of the population who could actually be citizens. But that's still a significant number, If there are 500,000 people in Athens, we're talking about 100,000 plus here who could be citizens. Well, the other thing you have to realize when thinking about a meeting of the Eklesia is that even if all citizens were members of the Eklesia, that didn't mean they all attended every meeting. Athens ruled over a land mass that was the size of the state of Rhode Island. These people did not have cars and interstates or high-speed trains or anything like that. They had to walk or ride some kind of animal if they wanted to get around. And so the farmers, the people working in trade along the coast or taking boats out into the Aegean, probably didn't have time to attend the meetings of the Eklesia. And so the Eklesia was left in the hands of urban elites, for the most part. Now, we're still talking about a meeting of several thousand people. And we know that that was the case because some of the meeting places that the Odeon, for instance, have survived, at least partially intact. And these are huge arenas that the people met in. And so, to thrive in the Eklesia, to really get something done in the Eklesia, the members of the Eklesia had to have the ability to speak well. Public speaking was the most sought-after skill in the Greek world, and especially in Athens. Those who could speak well, who were skilled at oratory, ended up having outsized power, in fact, dominating voting blocks in the Eklesia. The most prominent of these was a guy named Pericles, who for about 30 years in the middle of the 5th century BCE truly dominated Athenian politics. Just about anything that he wanted to get done, he got done because he was such a good public speaker that a huge block of citizens would simply line up behind him because he had them so thoroughly convinced about his ideas. So that's the Eklesia. There's more that we need to say about the way that functioned, and we'll talk about some cases here in a few minutes. There were a couple of other institutions that were important. We talked about the Deme. This was the kind of the voting precinct. There were 30 of these in Athens, and they corresponded to some extent with neighborhoods. And so people came to associate with their Demes as well. And then there's this body known as the Boule. That can be translated as the council. This was the main bureaucratic body of the Athenian government. This was the body that actually did the work that the Eklesia had ordered it to. They were the ones in charge of, maintaining the roads and seeing to the to the upkeep of the food supply and other things like this. They were basically the bureaucracy of the Athenian government. The bull was not a career thing. It was simply chosen by lot every year, and so it was random selection, and citizens would find themselves on the bull. It rotated between dames, and so it was unlikely that a person would ever have to serve on the bull more than once in their life. But it was a very important civic responsibility to do that on occasion. In addition to the Eklesia, which was the main legislative body of the Athenian government, and also its judicial body, they tried court cases as well, but the enforcement of the laws, the executive branch, if we want to call it that, were these magistrates. And like other polis, Athens had a system of magistrates with different responsibilities. Some magistrates were in charge of military affairs, others of financial affairs, others of religious affairs. Again, no separation between church and state. Government officials were the ones in charge of the religious rituals. And so there were, quite a number of magistrates selected in Athens. For the most part, these men had limited terms and lots of checks on their power. There were exceptions to that. The position of strategos, which was the main military leader of Athens, had a renewable term and was not subject to a great deal of oversight, and so that was probably the most powerful position in Athens. And in fact, Pericles, who I talked about, held the position of strategos for something like 10 or 12 years in a row, and used that to increase his power in other ways. There was also this institution known as ostracism. Now, if we go by the basic definition of ostracism, it means to exile somebody, to not pay attention to them, or whatever it was. Well, that definition originates with this institution in Athens. This was supposed to be a fail-safe, that if somebody was fomenting rebellion against the polis of Athens, if they were a threat to the state, that someone in the Eklesia could call for a vote of ostracism, where people would cast these names into big pots. They were written on shards of pottery. Those shards were known as ostracos or Ostra COI, and that's where we get the word ostracism from. It means pot shard, actually. And then they would count up these votes, and if people reached if the names reached a certain threshold, they were ostracized from the community. They were exiled for a period of 10 years. Interestingly, if they survived the 10 years, their property was retained for them, even their position among the citizenry was retained, and they could go back to Athens and kind of take up their lives again if they wanted to. The problem was that the Greek world was not terribly friendly to metics, to foreigners, and an Athenian thrown on the mercy of some other polis probably would not fare very well, because Athens tended to have a lot of enemies. And so somebody ostracized from Athens was, in a really precarious position. There's a lot of evidence that people, generally chose to commit suicide rather than submit to the sentence of ostracism. Pericles, though, in the 5th century, used ostracism as a defensive mechanism to make sure no one challenged his power. If somebody spoke out against Pericles in the Eklesia or proposed something that flew in the face of what Pericles was trying to do, his tendency was to call for a vote of ostracism. And Pericles was so popular and commanded such a huge voting bloc that it was likely that his rival would become ostracized and be exiled from the city. And so he did this as a way of eliminating political rivals. It was certainly not intended for that purpose. But Pericles abused it sufficiently to make sure that would happen. Okay, I've talked about Pericles already. I'll have more to say about him when we talk about the Peloponnesian War. The other thing we should note about Athens is the rich culture of the polis. Athens had these civic institutions, religious festivals and other things that required the production of a lot of cultural production. They had, for instance, a festival dedicated to the god Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, who was thought to appreciate theater, and so they would hold these competitions of playwrights annually at the Dionysian festival. Playwrights would write tragedies and comedies which were performed in front of the entire citizen body of Athens. In fact, it was a requirement to attend these things. And these plays comment frequently upon the social norms, the conventions, the ethics that were common in Athenian society. You are assigned to read and write a paper on one of these plays, The Trojan Women by Euripides. And so you need to ask yourself, okay, what kind of message is Euripides trying to send to his fellow citizens who would have been viewing this play at the Dionysian festival? So more on that later, but that's the context for this. The works of literature that survive from the Dionysian festival are some of the great landmark pieces in all of Western literature. Just to throw out a few names, Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound and his Oresteia, the Oedipus cycle, including Oedipus Rex and Oedipus at Colonus and Antigone, of Sophocles, and then several tragedies by Euripides, including the Bacchae, Electra, Medea. I mean, these are all, and the Trojan Women are all fantastic pieces of literature. The comedies of Aristophanes, the Frogs, the Clouds, and so forth and so on, are similar in quality, right? And also comment on the social conventions of Athens. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind. You have to keep this, you have to look for context when reading that play. The Athenians were also seemingly the first to develop a historical sensibility, at least the first to write down historical sensibilities. The historians Herodotus and Thucydides are the fathers of Western history, really kind of their works are the foundational works of Western historical thinking. And so we owe the Athenians that as well. And then, of course, philosophy. Both, Socrates and then Plato and Aristotle all lived and worked in Athens and were responding in many ways to Athenian society, Athenian politics, and formulating the philosophical ideas that they formulated. Aristotle was not a native-born Athenian, but did spend most of his adult life there, so we have to include him among Athenian philosophers. Right. Okay. Now, moving on. The next point is to talk about conflict between these two poleis, and really conflict in the classical age. If we recall, there's this huge power, the Persian Empire, that had established itself in the second half of the 6th century BCE as the dominant empire all over the Near Eastern world. In fact, the Persians had extended their rule all the way through Asia Minor, over here into the Greek-speaking world. The coast of Asia Minor here is called Ionia, the western coast, and it was populated almost entirely by Greek-speaking peoples, as was this region up here called Thrace. And so when the Persians conquered those Greek areas, these Greeks, who considered the Persians barbarians, like they did any other people who didn't speak Greek, were quite unhappy with this. Now, that forms the backdrop for... and this, by the way, despite the fact that the Persians were quite tolerant of other peoples. This is a document from the Persian Empire. Here Cyrus, the king of Persia, notes that when he went into Babylon, Babylani as it's called here, and became the ruler of Babylon, he kind of set himself up as the heir to the Babylonian throne. He invokes the names of the Babylonian gods. I resettled upon the command of Marduk, the great lord, all the gods of Caingir and Akkad. And so, he's following the orders of Marduk, the city god of Babylon. The Persians really tried to be accommodating to make themselves popular among the people they conquered. But the Greeks still didn't like them and chafed under their rule. Now, Around 495, I'm a century off, 495, the Greek city of Miletus, over here in Ionia, started a rebellion against the Persians. And they called upon the independent Greeks who had been conquered by Persia, people over here like Athens and Sparta, to come to their aid to fight, under the kind of the same banner of Greek independence. The Athenians sent some troops. Once they realized that the Persians outnumbered them greatly, they went back to Athens, and Miletus was nearly destroyed by the Persians as in retribution for their rebellion. But this ignited the Persian Wars, and we have to use plural there because this really takes place in multiple phases, so we can't necessarily talk about a single war. Over a couple of decades at the beginning of the 5th century, Persia fought a war against the Greeks. And even though the Greeks were vastly outnumbered by the Persians in most battles, even though the Persians on paper were far the stronger army, the Greeks managed to defeat them at nearly every turn. Even when they lost a battle, as in the famous Battle of Thermopylae, which took place up here in the region known as Boeotia in Greece, where 300 Spartans and a few hundred soldiers from other cities that usually get left out of the historical record, managed to hold off an invasion of Persians that was sweeping down into Attica long enough for the Athenians to evacuate their city entirely and send all of the population out here onto one of the islands in the Saronic Gulf, and thus save the whole population of Athens. So even when they lost a battle, they did so rather spectacularly and in ways that were, in the long term, advantageous to the Greeks. This really was a war of attrition. The Greeks simply had to hold the Persians off long enough so that it became prohibitively expensive and the Persians would withdraw their purposes. And that's precisely what happened. After a number of Greek victories, the Persians finally said, enough, we don't have the resources to fight this anymore. We're tired of this, and so we're moving out of the Greek world. And the Persians withdrew not only from the invasion of Greece, but also from Ionia over here. And the Ionian cities once more became independent, and that really pushes Greece into the classical age proper. In the 5th century, Greece, at least in certain respects, reached its highest point of political and cultural development, its greatest period of independence. It was during this time that writers like Herodotus and Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes were working. Socrates himself was coming of age at this point, and so a lot of the key figures in Greek history were all from this period. Pericles was dominant in Athens. And Athens and Sparta really emerged as the leading poleis in the Greek world. Now, the Spartans had fought valiantly in the war against the Persians, mostly on land. The Athenians had won some naval victories over the Persians and had won a couple of land victories as well. And so both of them felt very good about their military abilities. In the aftermath of the Persian War, they were still most afraid of another Persian invasion. So the Spartans, together with a number of other poleis on the Peloponnesus and up here into Boeotia, formed a defensive alliance known as the Peloponnesian League. Now, this was entirely for defense. This was not meant to be any kind of trade network or political hegemony or anything like that. Sparta, although it was reluctant really to, Sparta didn't play well with others, let's just put it that way. They were reluctant to have any close relations with other cities. They took up the leadership role in the Peloponnesian League. Partly to counter that and partly to advance their own interests, the Athenians entered into an alliance with all of the cities you see in pink here on the slide. And so pretty much the whole coastline of the Aegean, up here into the Dardanelles, in fact even up into the Black Sea, they formed an alliance known as the Delian League. Now this was ostensibly for the purposes of defense, like the Peloponnesian League. But if you look at the map there, you can see that this is just ready-made for a trade network. And in fact, Athens used the Delian League to set itself up at the heart, at the center of a massive trading network extending all the way up into the Black Sea. And this is how Athens became so dominant over the course of the 5th century economically. Now, Athens was not terribly friendly to anyone who was reluctant to join them or to stay in the Delian League. And in fact, there were those who became frustrated with what Athens was doing. One of the things that was most offensive was that at some point, and they did this out of fear of being invaded, but the treasury of the Delian League was on the island of Delos, which is all the way down here. In this group of islands are known as the Cyclades. This is Delos down here. And Delos is quite exposed, right? I mean, the Persians could easily sneak attack with their navy there, and so the Athenians said, we need to move the treasury of the Delian League to Athens. They did. They put it in the temple of Athena, their patron goddess, and it proved to be too great a temptation for politicians like Pericles, who started to dip into the treasury of the Delian League in order to pursue their own political projects. Athens had been destroyed during the Persian Wars. The army that the 300 Spartans held off so admirably for a time ultimately did sweep down and destroy the city of Athens. It didn't kill off the population because they had been able to flee, but Athens rebuilt itself over the course of the 5th century using mostly these funds from the Delian League treasury. And there were some members of the Delian League who said, this is wrong, we can't let Athens continue to do this. But Athens was quite ruthless in the way that they dealt with people who wanted to leave. Now, there was a lot of posturing between the Peloponnesian League and the Delian League over the course of the 5th century. They often got in each other's way, and both felt very good about their military prospects. They were all itching for a fight. This is reminiscent in its own way of 19th and early 20th century Europe, as these emerging powers were dominating large swaths of the globe, and they talked frequently in theory and in practice about fighting wars against each other, and ultimately this erupted into this massive cataclysm that we know as the Great War, or the First World War, World War I. Well, something similar happened in 5th century Greece. We have these two huge powers, Sparta and Athens, with lots of key allies and rivals on the side of the Delian League and the Peloponnesian League, and really both sides felt that they were going to come to conflict, that mastery of the Greek world required them to take on the other major power. So around the year 431, that is precisely what happened. One of the most important wars in the history of Western civilization was fought over about a 30-year period, 27 to be more precise, between 431 and 404 BCE, between Sparta and its allies, the members of the Peloponnesian League, and Athens and its allies, mostly members of the Delian League. This was a long, drawn-out, brutal war. It took place over 27 years, but we have to realize is that there were long periods of truce, where both sides were kind of building up their strength again, and then there would be times of cataclysmic violence. But it came down pretty much to a stalemate, much like the First World War did at the between 1914 and 1918. Athens had a navy that simply could not be countered by anything the Spartans had. Sparta had the most formidable land army, but Athens was able to counter invasion by building huge defensive walls, not only around Athens, but extending out from Athens all the way to the coast, to the port city of Piraeus. This was like a 5 to 10 mile stretch of walls, just encompassing these roads that went from Athens to Piraeus. And so Athens was impossible to besiege. There was no way that because they had access to this port, and so Sparta couldn't breach the walls. They didn't really have siege engines. They didn't specialize in things like that. And so even though they took over parts of Attica, the Athenians pulled most of their, sorry for all the yawns today, pulled most of their population into the walls of the city and kept them safe there, and were able to get goods in and out of the city through the port. Now, the problem of having so many people gathered together is the potential for disease, and in fact, early in the war, Athens had a huge outbreak of some kind of disease. We don't know exactly what it was, probably typhoid fever or typhus, but a huge outbreak of disease which may have killed off a third to a half of the population of Athens, leaving it in a weakened condition. Right. Now, I don't want to take the time here to go through every facet of this war. I do teach upper division Greek history, and you can come and get more details there if you like in some future semester. But this war got very bogged down, and neither side was really able to gain the upper hand on their rival. And really, to break the stalemate, one side or the other needed to turn to the other major power who was sort of standing on the sidelines watching this conflict play out. And I refer here, of course, to Persia. The Spartans were the first to do this. They stretched out to, kind of feelers to Persia, and essentially offered to allow Persia to reclaim the territory they had lost in the Persian Wars if they would side with Sparta and defeat Athens. So Sparta was going to give up all of Ionia here in return for Persian help. Okay, I'm sure the Ionians were not terribly thrilled about that, but they were mostly on the side of the Athenians. And this didn't help immediately, but over the course of a few years, the Persians and the Spartans were able to grind Athens down to the point that finally Athens sued for peace and submitted to terms of surrender. And most of the cities who were in the alliance with Sparta wanted to do what Athens had done to the city of Thasos, who had tried to remain neutral in the war. And Athens, although they were originally an Athenian ally, Athens took their navy up to Thasos, that's all the way up here, and besieged Thasos and destroyed the city and sold all of the population who were not killed into slavery. Well, this is precisely what the Spartan, or rather, a lot of the allies of the Spartans wanted to do with Athens. Now, that wasn't terribly practical because Athens was such a huge city. They would have, completely flooded the whole eastern Mediterranean with slaves if they did that. But in any case, the Spartans said, no, we can't do that. They did make Athens, well, they subjected them to a number of terms. First of all, Athens had to dismantle its democracy. And they chose a group of 30 men called the 30 Tyrants, or eventually called the 30 Tyrants, who had been during the war unfriendly to the Athenian war effort, who had sided with Sparta, or who were at least war protesters or something, and they put them in charge of Athens. So the government of the 30 Tyrants was what Athens was ruled by after the Peloponnesian War. However, after only about a year, the Athenians managed to overthrow the 30 Tyrants and reestablish democracy, and by that point, Sparta was occupied elsewhere and really was in no shape, no mood to go back to Athens and fight the battle over this. And so they kind of let it go. Athens also had to tear down its walls. They did attempt to rebuild them later. They never, I don't think, fully rebuilt the long walls, but this left them exposed and left them in a weakened condition. Now, you might think that Sparta was, really sitting in a good position after the Peloponnesian War. But in truth, Sparta, although they won the war, strictly speaking, they left themselves in a weakened condition. Lots and lots of Spartans died in the war. Particularly catastrophic for the Spartans was the death of thousands of the similars, that is, the elites who ran the Spartan society. And they had a hard time maintaining their system because they simply did not have enough of the similars after the Peloponnesian War. And about 30 years after the war, the city of Thebes, who had technically been on the side of Sparta in the war but had mostly remained neutral, became a kind of emerging power. They came down into the Peloponnesus, attacked Sparta, defeated Sparta, and freed all of the Messenians, which meant that the whole Spartan system was thrown into chaos and really was not workable anymore because their Helots were gone. And Sparta never again really emerged as a power in the Greek world. For most of the 4th century, after the Peloponnesian War, all of these Greek cities were quite weak. Thebes had a temporary kind of heyday, but then they too were weakened through various means. This allowed the people of Macedonia up here, who spoke the Greek language but had a very different culture than the Greeks did, and were considered by the Greeks to be barbarians, even though many of them spoke Greek. The ruler of Macedon in the 340s and 330s, whose name was Philip, managed either through diplomacy or through war, using different tactics at different times, managed to subject pretty much the whole Greek world to his hegemony, such that they acknowledged him as their ruler, and we'll pick it up with Philip and his son Alexander at a later time. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of everything that was happening in the classical world, and there was a lot of detail to take in. Do the best you can, try to focus on key terms, and most importantly, this is all context. Now it's important to go to the primary sources and to try to make sense of them. So in the next video, we will look at some primary sources. We'll actually go back to the Archaic Age and look at some Homer, and forward into the Classical Age and look at some other important texts, and work forward from there.